November 12, 1943. Camp Shanks, New York. Oberleutnant Hans-Georg Henke stands in the hold of the Liberty ship, transporting 300 German prisoners across the Atlantic, listening to a sound that makes no sense. Through the steel hull, transmitted by the water itself, comes a rhythmic hammering that seems to pulse from every direction at once. The frequency is wrong. No shipyard Henke knows operates with this kind of synchronized precision. He had surrendered 9 days earlier in Tunisia, part of Rommel's Afrika Korps, after watching British armour overwhelm positions that German intelligence insisted could not be flanked. The capture had felt like temporary misfortune. Germany possessed superior engineering, superior training, superior industrial organization developed over decades. America, Henke had been taught since joining the Wehrmacht in 1939, was a nation of individual craftsmen who could never match German systematic production. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But that sound filtering through the hull suggested something his military education had not prepared him for. It was not the irregular tapping of artisans working metal by hand. It was mechanical, relentless, synchronized across what seemed like impossible distances. Henke had worked briefly in his father's machine shop in Stuttgart before the war. He understood the difference between skilled labor and mass production. This sound belonged to assembly lines, not shipyards. The transport docked at Hampton Roads, Virginia, on November 15. As Henke descended the gangway with his fellow prisoners, he caught his first glimpse of American industrial capacity in a form that contradicted everything he believed about warfare. 7 Liberty ships occupied adjacent berths, their hulls identical, their superstructures indistinguishable. Each vessel measured 441 feet in length with a 69-foot beam, designed to carry 10,000 tons of cargo across oceans that German U-boats prowled with increasing desperation. What struck Henke was not the ships themselves, but their quantity. In German shipyards, cargo vessels were built individually by skilled workers who spent months fitting components together with the precision that made German engineering legendary throughout Europe. Each hull represented thousands of hours of expert labor. Yet here were 7 identical ships moored side by side, suggesting production methods that defied conventional shipbuilding wisdom. Master Sergeant William Dorsey, the military police officer processing the prisoners, had overseen German POW arrivals for 8 months. He had learned to recognize the moment when captured soldiers encountered their first evidence of American industrial capability. Some dismissed what they saw as propaganda. Others fell silent with the expression of men watching familiar certainties dissolve. Henke belonged to the second category. He studied the Liberty ships with an engineer's eye, noting the welded seams instead of rivets, the standardized components, the modular construction that suggested assembly rather than craftsmanship. This was not how ships were supposed to be built. Maritime tradition, stretching back centuries, insisted that seagoing vessels required individual attention from experienced artisans who understood the subtle requirements of structures designed to withstand ocean forces. The prisoners were loaded onto railway cars for transport to Camp Pickett in Virginia, traveling through countryside that revealed industrial activity on scales Henke had not imagined possible. Factories stretched for miles along the rail lines, their smokestacks marking steel mills, chemical plants, and manufacturing facilities operating in coordinated networks that suggested systematic organization rather than independent workshops. German military intelligence had provided detailed assessments of American industrial capacity before the war began. Those reports acknowledged America's automotive production but emphasized the nation's reliance on imported machine tools, its shortage of skilled craftsmen, and its historical inability to mobilize industrial resources for military purposes. The United States had required 2 years to achieve meaningful production levels during the First World War. Germany's planners assumed similar delays would characterize any American entry into the current conflict, but the evidence visible through the train windows contradicted those assumptions. Construction cranes dominated horizons in every direction. New factories rose from farmland that had been agricultural months earlier. Rail yards expanded to accommodate traffic volumes that strained existing infrastructure. This was not the industrial mobilization of a nation struggling to organize scattered resources. This was systematic expansion executed with the precision that German doctrine reserved for military operations. At Camp Pickett, Henke and 250 other German prisoners were assigned to barracks that exceeded anything they had experienced during 3 years of military service. Each man received an individual bed with mattress, blankets, and pillow. The mess hall served meals that included meat, fresh vegetables, bread, and coffee, in quantities that seemed wasteful by European standards. Guards explained that food would be provided according to Geneva Convention requirements, which mandated that prisoners receive rations comparable to those issued to American soldiers. The contrast with conditions in North Africa was so extreme that some prisoners initially suspected the treatment was temporary, designed to extract information before they were transferred to harsher facilities. Fritz Enslin, a tank gunner captured at the same time as Henke, later recalled joking with fellow prisoners that if they had known American captivity involved such conditions, they would have surrendered earlier instead of fighting until their ammunition ran out. The psychological foundation Henke had constructed during 4 years of military indoctrination rested on specific assumptions about comparative national capabilities. Germany possessed superior organization. German workers demonstrated superior skill. German engineering produced superior results. These were not opinions subject to debate, but facts confirmed by decades of industrial achievement that had made Germany the dominant manufacturing nation in Europe. American industry, according to the doctrine Henke had absorbed, excelled at producing simple commodities in large quantities, but lacked the sophisticated craftsmanship necessary for complex military equipment. Automobiles, refrigerators, consumer goods, yes. Precision machinery, aircraft engines, naval vessels, no. The United States would eventually mobilize its industrial capacity, but German forces would achieve decisive victories before American production reached meaningful levels. Camp Pickett held 3,000 German prisoners by December 1943, with new arrivals transported weekly from North African and Mediterranean battlefields. The camp's design reflected American engineering principles that emphasized standardized construction and systematic organization. Barracks followed identical layouts. Facilities were positioned for efficient movement of personnel and supplies. Everything operated according to schedules that prioritized predictable routine over individual flexibility. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, commanding the camp, had observed hundreds of German prisoners encountering American industrial reality for the first time. The pattern was consistent. Initial skepticism gave way to confused recognition that something fundamental about their understanding of comparative national capabilities required revision. But most prisoners lacked the industrial knowledge necessary to identify what specific assumptions were proving incorrect. Henke possessed that knowledge. His father's machine shop had supplied components to German shipyards before the war. He understood construction timelines, labor requirements, and the technical challenges inherent in building ocean-going vessels. Traditional German methods required 12 to 18 months to complete a cargo ship from keel laying to launch. Skilled workers hand-fitted thousands of components according to specifications that varied slightly for each vessel. Quality control depended on individual craftsmen whose expertise developed through years of apprenticeship. The Liberty ships Henke had seen at Hampton Roads contradicted those requirements in every detail. Welded construction instead of riveting suggested mass production techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing. Standardized components implied assembly line methods rather than custom fabrication. Most significantly, the sheer quantity of identical vessels indicated production rates that seemed mathematically impossible using conventional shipbuilding practices. On December 20th, Camp Pickett received authorization to employ German prisoners in agricultural work, supporting the local farming economy. Labor shortages caused by military conscription had created urgent needs for workers during harvest seasons. The Geneva Convention permitted prisoner employment in non-military activities, provided wages were paid and working conditions met specified standards. Henke volunteered for a work detail assigned to a farm 15 miles from camp, partly to escape the monotony of confinement, but primarily to observe more of American industrial capacity. The transport truck traveled through Nottoway County, passing farms that demonstrated mechanization levels far exceeding European agricultural practices. Tractors replaced horses. Mechanical harvesters eliminated manual grain cutting. Even small operations employed equipment that would have been considered advanced by German standards. The farmer who contracted for prisoner labor, Robert Whitfield, operated 200 acres growing tobacco, corn, and hay, using 4 workers and equipment purchased through New Deal agricultural programs. He explained that labor shortages had forced him to invest in machinery capable of performing tasks previously requiring dozens of men. The cost initially seemed prohibitive, but increased productivity offset equipment expenses within 2 growing seasons. Henke recognized the pattern. American agriculture had mechanized to compensate for labor scarcity, exactly as German doctrine predicted. But the scale of mechanization suggested something more systematic than individual farmers making independent purchasing decisions. Equipment manufacturers, financing programs, technical support networks, all operated in coordinated systems that enabled rapid adoption of advanced technology across entire regions. During the lunch break, Whitfield described changes in American manufacturing since Pearl Harbor. Automotive plants had converted to tank production. Textile mills manufactured parachutes. Even his equipment supplier had switched from farm machinery to ammunition components. The transition, he insisted, had occurred with remarkable speed. Facilities designed for consumer goods were producing military hardware within months of conversion. This contradicted German assumptions about industrial flexibility. Converting civilian manufacturing to military production required specialized tooling, trained workers, and systematic reorganization of supply chains. German planners had estimated American conversion would require minimum 2 years to achieve meaningful output levels. Yet Whitfield's casual description suggested the process had been accomplished with efficiency that challenged those projections. The work detail returned to Camp Picket at 1600 hours. As the truck approached the main gate, Henke noticed something that had escaped his attention during previous days. Beyond the perimeter fence, construction crews were expanding the camp's capacity, adding barracks identical to existing structures. The work proceeded with mechanical precision, suggesting assembly rather than building. Prefabricated sections arrived by truck and were positioned according to predetermined layouts. Walls rose in synchronized sequences performed by crews that clearly followed standardized procedures. It was the same pattern visible at the shipyards, the same systematic approach evident in the agricultural mechanization. Americans did not build things through individual craftsmanship. They assembled them through coordinated processes that emphasized speed and standardization over artisanal precision. The question was whether such methods could produce quality equal to German craftsmanship, or whether American industrial output consisted primarily of quantity without corresponding excellence. That evening, in the barracks he shared with 40 other prisoners, Henke attempted to explain his observations to men whose military training had not included engineering education. Most dismissed American industrial capacity as irrelevant to battlefield outcomes. Germany possessed superior tactics, superior leadership, superior fighting spirit. These intangible qualities would overcome any American advantages in material production. But Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, who had served as supply officer for an armored battalion, understood the mathematics of logistics. Armies fought with equipment, ammunition, and supplies. Training and morale mattered, but ultimately battles were won by forces that maintained material superiority over extended campaigns. If American industry could indeed produce military hardware at the rates Henke suggested, German forces would face opponents whose material advantages compounded with every month of war. The conversation died as lights out was announced at 2100 hours. But Henke lay awake considering implications that military doctrine had never addressed. What happened when systematic mass production collided with traditional craftsmanship? What happened when quantity reached levels that overwhelmed quality? What happened when an entire national economy mobilized with the efficiency Americans seemed capable of achieving? January 1944 brought the first direct evidence that would answer those questions in ways that shattered every assumption Henke had constructed about comparative industrial capabilities. The camp commandant authorized selected prisoners to receive American newspapers as part of a program designed to expose German soldiers to uncensored information about the war's progress. The newspapers, edited in English, required translation by prisoners who possessed language skills. Henke's English was functional, learned through technical manuals his father's shop used for imported machine tools. On January 8th, he translated an article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch that described recent shipbuilding achievements at Kaiser Yards in California. The statistics seemed so exaggerated that Henke initially assumed translation errors. According to the article, American shipyards had produced 2,710 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1944. The average construction time had decreased from 230 days in early 1942 to 42 days by 1944. One shipyard had assembled a complete Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. The numbers were impossible. No shipyard could reduce construction time from 8 months to 6 weeks, while simultaneously increasing total output by orders of magnitude. German shipyards, despite decades of experience and systematic organization, required minimum 12 months to complete vessels comparable to Liberty ships. American claims suggested production rates that exceeded German capacity by factors approaching 10 to 1. Henke checked the translation 3 times, searching for errors that would explain the discrepancy. But the English was straightforward, and the article included details too specific to be propaganda fabrication. Names of shipyards, exact dates of record achievements, explanations of modular construction techniques that enabled unprecedented speed. This was technical reporting, not exaggerated claims designed for morale purposes. Klaus Becker examined the newspaper with the skepticism of a supply officer trained to identify false intelligence. His conclusion matched Henke's. If the statistics were even approximately accurate, German military planning had fundamentally miscalculated American industrial capacity. An enemy that could build ships faster than submarines could sink them, possessed strategic advantages that negated tactical superiority in individual engagements. The implications cascaded through military logic like structural failures propagating through stressed metal. German U-boats had sunk 2,963 Allied ships in 1941 and 1942. This represented Germany's most effective strategic weapon, the submarine campaign that should have strangled Allied supply lines and prevented American power from reaching European battlefields. But if American shipyards were indeed producing vessels faster than they could be destroyed, the entire U-boat strategy collapsed into futility. Word of the newspaper article spread through the camp with the velocity of information that contradicted established beliefs. Reactions varied from outright rejection to careful reconsideration of assumptions that had seemed unquestionable. Senior officers dismissed American claims as propaganda designed to demoralize prisoners. Younger soldiers, particularly those with industrial backgrounds, recognized that specific technical details in the article suggested genuine achievements rather than fabricated statistics. The debate continued through January as additional newspapers provided accumulating evidence of American production capabilities. Aircraft manufacturing, tank production, ammunition output. Every report described quantities that exceeded German capacity by margins that made tactical excellence increasingly irrelevant. Germany could win individual battles through superior training and doctrine, but American industry was producing material advantages that compounded with every month of sustained production. On February 3rd, Camp Pickett received an unusual directive from the Provost Marshal General's office. Selected German prisoners would be taken on supervised tours of American industrial facilities as part of a psychological warfare program designed to demonstrate Allied material superiority. The tours would comply with Geneva Convention restrictions prohibiting exposure of prisoners to propaganda, but would provide factual information about American economic capacity. Henke was selected for the first tour group based on his technical education and his demonstrated interest in industrial subjects. 20 prisoners, accompanied by 6 military police officers and 2 intelligence specialists, boarded a bus on February 9th for transport to destinations undisclosed until departure. The bus traveled northeast toward Richmond, passing through countryside transformed by wartime mobilization. New highways carried traffic volumes that required expanded infrastructure. Housing developments surrounded factories that had not existed 2 years earlier. Construction continued everywhere, suggesting expansion without apparent limits. The first stop was announced as they approached the city's industrial district, Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, the facility that had launched Henke's understanding of American industrial capacity. What happened during that tour, and what Henke witnessed in the months that followed, would complete the psychological transformation from confident soldier to stunned observer of industrial capabilities that redefined the possible limits of mass production. The collision between German craftsmanship traditions and American systematic manufacturing was about to demonstrate which philosophy would prevail when quantity and speed challenged quality and precision. Newport News Shipbuilding occupied 26 acres of Tidewater, Virginia shoreline, its infrastructure constructed over 5 decades of maritime tradition. But what Henke witnessed on February 9, 1944, bore no resemblance to traditional shipbuilding as he understood it. The military police escort led the prisoners through gates designed to control access rather than display manufacturing processes. Security protocols prohibited photography and restricted observation to designated viewing areas. Yet even from controlled positions, the scope of operations visible contradicted fundamental assumptions about maritime construction. 18 American shipyards were building Liberty ships using standardized designs and prefabricated components. But the scale visible at Newport News suggested something beyond individual facilities operating independently. This was systematic coordination across an entire industry, synchronized through common specifications that enabled interchangeable parts manufactured thousands of miles apart. Lieutenant Richard Hayes, the Army intelligence specialist accompanying the tour, explained the basic statistics with matter-of-fact precision that made the numbers more shocking than propaganda exaggeration would have been. 2,710 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945. Average construction time reduced from 8 months to 42 days. The SS Robert E. Peary assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes from keel laying to launch. Henke performed mental calculations that refused to produce sensible results. 42 days meant German shipyards required 8 to 10 times longer to complete comparable vessels. 4 days construction time was physically impossible using any known maritime engineering practices. Either American claims were fabricated for propaganda purposes, or German understanding of industrial capability contained fundamental errors that invalidated decades of accumulated expertise. The viewing platform overlooked 3 Liberty ships in various stages of completion. Each vessel measured 441 feet in length, with a beam of 69 feet, designed to carry 10,800 deadweight tons. But what struck Henke was not the ships themselves, but the method of their construction. Complete deck houses, double bottom sections, stern frame assemblies and bow units were being prefabricated separately and assembled using massive cranes. The process resembled automotive manufacturing more than traditional shipbuilding, where German shipyards built vessels piece by piece from keel upward. American yards assembled pre-manufactured modules in sequences that dramatically reduced time on the launching ways. Massive gantry cranes, their steel frameworks towering above the construction area, lifted sections weighing dozens of tons with mechanical precision that eliminated the patient manual positioning German craftsmen employed. Approximately 80% of the steel for each Liberty ship was already assembled before the keel was laid. This inverted traditional construction logic entirely. German practice treated keel laying as the beginning of ship construction. American methods treated it as an assembly of pre-manufactured components. The welding operations visible throughout the yard represented another departure from conventional maritime engineering. Liberty ships used welded construction, instead of riveting, substituting mechanical joints that could be completed rapidly by workers trained in weeks rather than years. Henke had learned riveting during his apprenticeship, understanding it as skilled labor requiring judgment developed through extensive experience. Each Liberty ship required nearly 50 miles of welding, but welders could be trained to productive work in little more than a week. Klaus Becker, standing beside Henke, verbalized the question both men were considering. If Americans could train workers in days to perform operations that Germans required months to master, what advantage did German craftsmanship provide? Quality versus quantity was supposed to favor German precision, but if American systematic methods produced acceptable quality at 10 times German speed, the mathematical outcome became inevitable. The tour continued to fabrication areas where ship components were manufactured in parallel production lines. Deck plates, bulkheads, and structural members were cut, shaped, and assembled in shops separate from the launching ways, then transported to final assembly positions. The organization resembled Ford's automobile factories more than any shipyard Henke had seen in Germany. Specialization, standardization, systematic workflow, everything designed to maximize production speed rather than individual craftsmanship. Lieutenant Hayes explained the labor force composition with statistics that challenged German assumptions about industrial capability. Approximately 1.8 million Americans were employed in Liberty shipyards during the war, many of them women performing welding operations that required less upper body strength than traditional riveting. Some yards employed workforces where women comprised significant percentages of production workers, demonstrating that systematic methods enabled participation by populations German doctrine excluded from heavy manufacturing. The prisoners were permitted to observe one welding station, where a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, operated equipment with confidence that suggested thorough training despite her obvious inexperience with maritime construction. Her work was monitored by quality inspectors who used standardized gauges rather than relying on visual assessment and personal judgment. The welds she produced met specifications enforced through systematic measurement, not artisanal expertise. Henke recognized the philosophical revolution this represented. German manufacturing tradition emphasized individual skill developed through lengthy apprenticeship. Master craftsmen carried knowledge acquired over decades, passed to students through personal instruction. American methods replaced individual expertise with systematic procedures that could be taught rapidly and performed consistently by workers whose only qualification was willingness to follow standardized instructions. The economic implications cascaded through Henke's calculations like structural failures propagating through overstressed metal. Germany possessed approximately 80 million people. The United States possessed 130 million. If American industrial methods enabled mobilization of labor forces, including women and minorities, while German methods restricted production to traditionally trained male craftsmen, the disparity in potential output exceeded simple population ratios. The tour concluded with a brief presentation by the yard's production manager, who described recent improvements in construction efficiency. Over 3,000 improvement suggestions had been received during the war, collectively saving $45 million and 31 million labor hours. Workers were encouraged to identify inefficiencies and propose solutions, creating bottom-up optimization that supplemented top-down planning. This contradicted German hierarchical management, where expertise flowed from engineers to workers, but rarely in reverse. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The bus returned to Camp Pickett through the countryside, transformed by industrial mobilization visible everywhere. New factories, expanded infrastructure, housing developments for workers recruited from across the nation. The scale suggested systematic coordination that exceeded anything Germany had achieved despite decades of military-industrial planning. America was not simply mobilizing existing capacity, it was creating new capacity on timelines that defied conventional understanding of industrial development. That evening, Henke attempted to reconcile observations with doctrine he had accepted without question for 5 years. German military training had emphasized material advantages Germany possessed over potential enemies: superior organization, superior technology, superior workforce skills developed through rigorous training systems. These advantages were supposed to offset any numerical disadvantages and enable Germany to defeat larger but less efficient opponents. But the evidence from Newport News suggested American industrial methods negated traditional German advantages through systematic approaches that emphasized speed and standardization over individual craftsmanship. If ships could indeed be built in 42 days instead of 12 months, if workers could be trained in weeks instead of years, if production could be scaled by recruiting populations Germany excluded from manufacturing, then German victory required tactical and strategic excellence sufficient to overcome material disparities approaching 10-1. The mathematical impossibility became increasingly apparent to prisoners whose industrial backgrounds enabled comprehension of manufacturing statistics. Klaus Becker spent hours analyzing the numbers, searching for errors or exaggerations that would restore German assumptions about comparative capability. His conclusion matched Henke's. Either the American claims were entirely fabricated, which seemed unlikely given the specific technical details provided, or German military planning had fundamentally miscalculated enemy industrial capacity. March 1944 brought authorization for additional industrial tours, designed to expose German prisoners to evidence of American manufacturing capacity. The psychological warfare program's objective was transparent: demonstrate Allied material superiority so overwhelming that German soldiers would recognize continued resistance as futile. The Geneva Convention prohibited coerced propaganda exposure, but factual information presented without commentary complied with international agreements governing prisoner treatment. Henke volunteered for every available tour opportunity, driven by determination to understand industrial capabilities that contradicted his military education. On March 24, 20 prisoners boarded buses for transport to Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. The 3,000-mile journey required 5 days of rail travel, providing extended observation of the American industrial landscape. The train crossed the Appalachian Mountains, traversed the Midwest agricultural heartland, climbed through Rocky Mountain passes, and descended to California's coastal valleys. Throughout the journey, evidence of industrial mobilization dominated every populated region. By 1944, the Kaiser Richmond yards were the largest shipbuilding complex in the world, occupying hundreds of acres with facilities designed specifically for mass production. The scale visible upon arrival exceeded anything Henke had imagined possible. 4 separate Kaiser shipyards in Richmond had produced 747 ships during the war, more than any other complex in the United States. Kaiser's shipyards together accounted for 27% of total U.S. maritime commission. Construction, completed in 2/3 the time and at 1/4 the cost of other facilities. The production methods visible at Richmond made Newport News appear conservative by comparison. Massive whirly cranes, originally developed for Grand Coulee Dam construction, lifted prefabricated sections weighing hundreds of tons. 17 banks of welding machines operated on each side of hulls, with decks pre-assembled in 7 large sections instead of 23 smaller pieces. For the record-setting SS Robert E. Peary, workers pre-assembled components into 97 units that cranes positioned on the launching ways. The systematic organization exceeded anything German industry had achieved. Multiple parallel production lines operated simultaneously, each following standardized procedures that eliminated individual decision-making in favor of predetermined workflows. Quality control relied on statistical sampling and systematic measurement rather than comprehensive individual inspection. Workers specialized in single operations performed repeatedly rather than mastering complete assembly processes. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, who had accompanied the prisoners from Camp Pickett, explained Kaiser's background with details that made the achievement more remarkable. Henry Kaiser had built dams, including Hoover and Grand Coulee, but had never constructed ships before entering the maritime industry. He applied civil engineering principles and mass production techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing to an industry that had resisted such methods for centuries. The result was production capacity that exceeded experienced shipbuilders through systematic organization rather than accumulated expertise. By 1944, Kaiser's Richmond yards routinely completed Liberty ships in little over 2 weeks using standard methods. 3 ships per day rolled from launching ways designed to maximize throughput rather than optimize individual vessel construction. Henke observed workforce composition that reinforced patterns visible at Newport News. By mid-1944, women comprised over 27% of production workers at Richmond yards, including over 40% of welders. The systematic methods Kaiser employed enabled rapid training and integration of workers, regardless of background or previous experience. What mattered was willingness to follow standardized procedures, not years of apprenticeship or inherited craft knowledge. The tour included observation of prefabrication facilities, where major ship components were manufactured in assembly line fashion. Bow sections, stern assemblies, engine mounts, deck houses, all built in separate shops by specialized teams, then transported to launching ways for final integration. The approach allowed multiple workers to labor on a given ship simultaneously, under far better conditions than open slipways provided. The psychological impact on German prisoners varied according to their industrial sophistication. Younger soldiers with limited technical education often dismissed what they saw as temporary wartime expediency that would collapse once American mobilization ended. Older prisoners with manufacturing experience recognized systematic organization that would outlast any specific military requirement. These methods represented fundamental transformation of industrial practice, not desperate improvisation. Henke spent the return journey to Virginia, analyzing implications that extended beyond immediate military concerns. If American industrial methods could produce ships 10 times faster than German yards, the same principles likely applied across all manufacturing sectors. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, everything produced through mass manufacturing could theoretically achieve similar productivity advantages. Germany's tactical excellence and superior training would face material disadvantages that compounded with every month of Elites' sustained production. The mathematical certainty became inescapable. By 1945, America had built 2,710 Liberty ships. German U-boats, despite tactical successes, could never sink vessels faster than American yards replaced them. The submarine campaign that was supposed to strangle Allied supply lines had failed not through German tactical errors, but through American industrial capacity that overwhelmed German production by margins approaching 10-1. April 1944 brought news that confirmed patterns Henke had observed during industrial tours. Allied forces were accumulating material advantages visible in every theatre of operation. Equipment losses that would cripple German formations were replaced within days for American units. Supply shortages that plagued Wehrmacht logistics were unknown to Allied forces, whose industrial output exceeded battlefield consumption by overwhelming margins. The prisoners received American newspapers with increasing frequency, as camp administrators implemented policies designed to expose German soldiers to uncensored information. The statistics documented industrial achievements that validated everything Henke had witnessed. Aircraft production is measured in thousands per month. Tank manufacturing exceeded German output by factors of 5-1. Ammunition supplies sufficient to sustain offensive operations that German forces could only dream of conducting. Klaus Becker, whose supply officer training enabled sophisticated logistics analysis, calculated rough estimates of comparative production capacity. His conclusions matched Henke's observations. America was producing military equipment at rates that exceeded German capacity by margins so large that tactical excellence became increasingly irrelevant. Superior training and doctrine mattered when material ratios approached parity. When one side possessed 10 times the equipment, individual quality advantages disappeared beneath quantitative superiority. The psychological transformation among prisoners followed predictable patterns. Initial denial gave way to confused recognition that fundamental assumptions required revision. German superiority in organization, training, and technology had been military gospel, repeated until it became unquestionable truth. But American industrial capacity demonstrated that systematic mass production could overwhelm traditional craftsmanship through methods that emphasized speed, standardization, and workforce mobilization rather than individual expertise. By summer 1944, most prisoners with industrial backgrounds had abandoned beliefs about inevitable German victory. The mathematics were too clear. America possessed a larger population, superior resource access, and manufacturing methods that enabled production rates Germany could not match. Tactical victories might continue, but the strategic outcome was determined by industrial capacity that favored Allies by margins that compounded with every month of sustained production. Henke's final industrial tour occurred in August 1944, when 20 prisoners visited Ford's Willow Run facility in Michigan. The bomber assembly line that produced B-24 Liberators at unprecedented rates provided final confirmation of patterns visible in shipbuilding. American industrial methods could mass-produce complex precision equipment at speeds that defied traditional manufacturing wisdom. The parallels between shipbuilding and aircraft production were unmistakable. Prefabrication, standardization, systematic workflows, rapid worker training, everything designed to maximize production speed rather than individual craftsmanship. The result was output that exceeded German capacity, despite America's later entry into industrial mobilization. September 1944 brought personal correspondence privileges that allowed limited communication with families in Germany. Henke wrote carefully worded letters that complied with censorship requirements while attempting to convey observations that had transformed his understanding of the war's likely outcome. He could not explicitly describe American industrial capacity, but could hint at scales of production that suggested German victory was mathematically impossible given current trajectories. The responses from his father, whose machine shop continued operating under wartime contracts, revealed the gap between civilian understanding in Germany and reality visible to prisoners in America. German propaganda emphasized Allied weaknesses and German technological superiority. Civilians believed Germany possessed industrial advantages that would eventually enable victory despite temporary setbacks. They had no comprehension of American manufacturing capacity that exceeded German output by factors approaching 10-1. The war's final phase played out with mathematical inevitability, determined by industrial capacity rather than battlefield tactics. German forces continued fighting with skill and determination that reflected superior training. But material disadvantages compounded with every month of Allied production that replaced losses faster than combat could inflict them. German equipment destroyed in battle was irreplaceable. Allied equipment damaged or lost was supplemented from industrial output that exceeded battlefield consumption. May 1945 brought Germany's unconditional surrender. Henke, still imprisoned at Camp Pickett, understood that defeat had been determined not by any specific battle, but by industrial capacity that made German victory impossible regardless of tactical excellence. The ships he had observed at Newport News and Richmond represented systematic manufacturing capability that Germany could never match using traditional craftsmanship methods. The liberation of German-held territories revealed the full extent of industrial disparity. American forces operated with equipment, abundance that German soldiers had never experienced. Supply difficulties that plagued Wehrmacht operations were unknown to Allied units, whose logistics reflected industrial output measured in ratios approaching 10-1. Every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable. Every American tank lost was supplemented from production that exceeded battlefield consumption. Henke remained in American custody until repatriation in 1946. The 2 years of imprisonment had fundamentally altered his understanding of industrial capability and national power. Germany's defeat resulted not from inferior soldiers or flawed tactics, but from industrial methods that could not compete with American mass production. Traditional craftsmanship, which German doctrine had elevated as superior to mechanical standardization, it had proven inadequate when confronting systematic manufacturing organized for maximum output rather than individual quality. The psychological transformation was permanent. Henke returned to Stuttgart, understanding that future industrial competition would favor nations that mastered mass production techniques America had perfected during the war. German craftsmanship traditions, while valuable for specialized applications, could not compete with systematic methods that enabled rapid scaling of output through workforce mobilization and standardized procedures. The irony was profound. Germany had entered the war believing industrial superiority would enable victory over numerically larger opponents. American manufacturing methods, initially dismissed as producing quantity without quality, had demonstrated that systematic organization could achieve both speed and precision through approaches that German expertise had failed to imagine. The ships built in 42 hours represented not just maritime construction, but fundamental transformation of industrial practice that would define manufacturing for generations. Charles Sorensen's bomber assembly line had proven that complex aircraft could be mass-produced like automobiles. Henry Kaiser's shipyards had demonstrated that ocean-going vessels could be assembled faster than traditional craftsmen believed physically possible. Frank Walker's fuel chemistry had shown that systematic testing could solve problems established experts declared unsolvable. Each achievement shared common principles: standardization, systematic organization, rapid worker training, continuous improvement, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. The legacy extended far beyond World War II military production. American manufacturing methods pioneered during wartime mobilization became templates for post-war industrial development worldwide. Japanese manufacturers studied American techniques and developed just-in-time production systems that further refined efficiency principles. European industries adopted standardization and systematic workflows that replaced traditional craft-based manufacturing. The assembly line revolution that began with Model T automobiles reached full maturity with Liberty ships and B-24 bombers, establishing manufacturing principles that dominated global industry for the remainder of the 20th century. Henke's experience represented countless German prisoners who witnessed American industrial capacity and understood that their nation's defeat had been determined by manufacturing capabilities rather than battlefield performance. The 42-hour construction time for Liberty ships was not propaganda exaggeration, but documented achievement that validated systematic approaches to complex manufacturing. Traditional craftsmanship had encountered mass production, and the outcome demonstrated which philosophy would prevail when speed and scale mattered more than individual precision. The question German prisoners confronted was not whether American claims were accurate, but how Germany had so completely miscalculated enemy industrial capacity. Intelligence, failures, doctrinal assumptions, and cultural biases had combined to create fundamental misunderstanding of American manufacturing potential. The result was military strategy based on incorrect assessment of comparative capabilities, leading to outcomes determined by industrial ratios rather than tactical excellence. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.